This is a subject near and dear to my heart because it's a topic that I think is neglected far too often in our discussions of security. And I should say up front that once again, you're going to hear my views. They're not the views of anybody else, and I'm going to say some fairly sharp things, which I hope you will find rather controversial and perhaps differ with. And I want to start out by, this section is about respect for rule of law and figuring out what rule of law is and why we should care about it. And the best example of that I've seen of rule of law, in this case the absence of rule of law, and the consequences of that, happened the last time I lived in Liberia, and in Congo Town, neighborhood in eastern Monrovia. It's a mixed neighborhood, Gio and Mandingo. And a couple of neighbors got into a dispute over the property line. I mean, I'm sure many of you own houses. You probably have an argument over whose property is the tree on, right? Well, the dispute got kind of heated, and it came to blows. The two men got into a fight. Pretty soon their families came out of the two houses and they joined the fight. And then the rest of the community started streaming into the street to see what was going on. But they didn't see two neighbors fighting over a property line. What the Gios saw was a Gio man being beat up by a bunch of Mandingos. And what the Mandingos saw was a Mandingo man being beat up by a bunch of Gios. And they all joined in. Pretty soon they started going back and getting their clubs and knives. Before it was over, the riot lasted 3 days. Burned down 5 city blocks, including both houses. Now, why did that happen? It happened because the two neighbors didn't trust the magistrate and wouldn't go to the police. Because rule of law wasn't a functional presence in that community. Hadn't been for some time. It's one of the best examples I've ever seen of what rule of law really means at the citizen level. It's confidence that you can go to the state to adjudicate disputes and you get a fair settlement. It's confidence that the police will help get you to that place. Now, you're going to see this. See this slide again when my colleague Dan Hampton talks about security sector reform next week. What the slides intended to articulate is the idea that rule of law and respect for rule of law provides the foundation upon which all security activities go forward in the state. In other words, everybody that's part of this process, the guys with guns at the top, that's the police, the military, everybody that imposes state authority. The guys on the bottom right, the oversight and management bodies, Congress, the legislature, the ministries, the office of the president, elected officials. And all those folks on the left that aren't necessarily part of the state, but they're part of the security sector. They contribute to the security sector. Civil society, the press, NonState actors. All of them need to be founded on rule of law, on respect for rule of law. Now, this is about the security sector, but of course, rule of law is a broader concept. Rule of law is the foundation that all state activities ought to be built on. So not just the security providers, public health, transportation, communications, power, all of those functions of the state that are delivered to its citizens need to be rule of law compliant. So, okay, what does that mean? So let's talk a little bit about how rule of law is defined. One of the kind of interesting things here is that while you'll hear all kinds of arguments about how you define terrorism, everybody pretty much agrees on how you define rule of law across the community. One of the really striking things, if you deal in the international community and you deal with these issues, everybody pretty much agrees on what rule of law ought to look like. And specifically, It's a principle under which all persons, including the president and the legislature and the chief of defense forces and the local chairman at Toyota, all of them are subject to rule of law, subject to the law. All of them are accountable. Institutions and entities, public and private, including the state itself, including the Presidential Guard and the intelligence services, all are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated. That means everybody knows what they are. Everybody can read them. Equally enforced. So the same law for everyone. Not one law for poor people and another law if you're rich, or you're the brother-in-law of the president, or you're a senior officer in the Presidential Guard. Equally enforced for everyone and independently adjudicated. That is to say, the judge or the magistrate's going to hand down a decision according to the law, and he's not going to do what the president or the local chief of police or the local warlord tells him to do, and that are consistent with international human rights principles, consistent with basic expectations of justice and fairness. Now, what does this mean in practice? And that's what's down here at the bottom. And I want to make a central point here. You cannot separate policing and the justice system when you talk about rule of law. They're both part of the same concept. Pascal said that justice without force is powerless, but force without justice is tyranny. So the justice sector, no matter how good it is, if it doesn't have an enforcement arm, the justice sector isn't going to be able to do anything. On the other hand, if you have a police force but they have no one to take their suspects to, or the local magistrate is corrupt, they know the criminals are going to pay him off as soon as they get to court, or he's controlled by special interests that are going to hand down decisions in their favor at the expense of everyone else. If both pieces don't function effectively, then rule of law is undermined. Now, if both do function effectively, you can accomplish remarkable things building a culture of respect for rule of law, even in some of the most difficult environments. And the best example of this, one of the best examples of this I think we can find, is in South Africa in 1996. Now, this is 2 years after the transition to black majority rule. And if you're in the security and law enforcement business in South Africa, times are very, very bad. The old security services, the old police and military and justice lack legitimacy because they're all rooted in the apartheid era. But the new services are just in the process of being constructed and constituted. And there's a real problem in South Africa. There's a perception, in fact, it's a pretty accurate perception, that if you got a lot of money, you got a lot of political influence, you remember the African National Congress, leadership, that the law doesn't apply to you. Corruption is rampant. Evidence of law breaking among senior connected individuals is clear to everybody. And it's really starting to undermine the legitimacy of the transition and the success of the movement to black majority rule. So what do the South Africans do? Leadership of South Africa says we got to do something. So they organized a special body. They were called the Scorpions. And they included both a small group of police and a small group of prosecutors. So someone from both sides, from the policing side and from the justice sector side. Now, they couldn't afford to fix the entire police force overnight, but they could afford to spend a lot of effort building a small core of senior professional law enforcement officers who would enforce the law. And they organized them. They were carefully vetted to ensure there was no taint of corruption, no background of law breaking. They were trained intensively over a period of several months. Some of them were sent to Quantico and trained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the United States. They were given by the legislature jurisdiction over everyone. and everything. One of the reasons that criminality was going unaddressed was because stovepiping in the justice system and problems of jurisdictional lines were making it hard for prosecutors to make cases. So the legislature said, we're going to give you a charter to try all these criminal cases. The prosecutors, being part of the team, were able to explain to the law enforcement officers, this is what I need to get a conviction in the court, okay? This is the evidence I need you to collect. That combination, by the way, the police were paid a salary, as were the prosecutors, that removed any real likelihood that they were going to become victims of corruption themselves, reduced the temptation dramatically. They were also scrutinized with intense oversight from the executive level. Over the next 2 years, the Scorpions brought to justice a remarkable group of senior politicians, senior officials, powerful and rich economic actors. They arrested them, arraigned them, tried them, and they had one of the highest conviction rates in the international law enforcement community. That, to a great extent, restored the credibility of the national government as it completed the transition to black majority rule. And it laid a foundation of respect for rule of law and sent a message to everybody in South African society that said no one is above the law and everybody is going to be held accountable. It went a long way to ensuring that that transition was successful. Now, the example of that for us is that while rule of law is kind of a hard concept to get your hands around, and changing the nature of rule of law, the strength of rule of law, is a challenging activity involving a lot of different actors, including society itself. It is possible, and it is important. Okay. You're going to see this slide again next week as well. And I've talked about this before. Changing norms in the African security sectors. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. I mean, the title says it all. Respect for rule of law, rejection of corruption, nonpartisan security forces, acting constitutionally. That's the new norm in Africa. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. And I'll particularly want to point to that last bullet. Security services that are governed by law, not men, provide security and safety to citizens in nonpartisan ways. One of the best examples of the new norms in Africa is found in Malawi. And in the recent presidential elections in Malawi, for those of you who didn't follow them, President Banda was running for re-election against Peter Mutharika. And as the voting results started to come in, it became evident that President Banda was going to lose. So the president called up the Chief of Defense Forces, said, General, I want you to send the military out and confiscate the ballot boxes. And the Chief of Defense Forces, I'm sorry to say, said, yes, ma'am, picked up the phone and called the next person in the chain of command in Malawi, who was the Chief of Operations of the Malawian Armed Forces, General Malana. General Malana, President wants you to send the army out, confiscate all the ballot boxes. To which General Malana responded, General, I know what the Constitution says. The Electoral Commission is responsible for that, not the Army. That is not our role, and I'm not going to do it. After he hung up the phone, the Chief of Defense Forces called all the way down to a couple of brigade commanders directly. Went around the Chief of Operations. Said, I want you to send your battalions out, occupy the balloting sites, and confiscate the ballot boxes. To which the brigade commanders responded, Sir, our chain of command goes through the Chief of Operations. That's how we receive our orders. After which, Chief of Defense Forces called down to a couple of battalion commanders, had the same conversation, and got the same answer. That is rule of law. And it is not rule of men. And I say not rule of men because the Chief of Defense Forces was General Odillo, who 2 years previously was asked by members of the legislature upon the death of the president to arrest the vice president who was supposed to succeed so that the president's brother could violate the Constitution and become the new president. And at that time, General Odillo had said, that's not what the Constitution says, and I'm not going to do that. Bringing us back to rule of men versus rule of law. These outcomes are about individuals and institutions who subject themselves to rule of law, who know what the rules are, who read the Constitution, who understand their responsibilities, and are willing to make hard choices to live up to those responsibilities. And my suggestion is that the General Milanas of the world, and those brigade commanders and battalion commanders, they are the future. They are the direction that Africa is moving. Provided that the coming generation of strategic leaders, that would be you, continue that process. Last point. This is the second example I wanted to talk about. And it's a case I'm very fond of, Sierra Leone. And it's not military, it's police. Now, in Sierra Leone, the tradition up until the election in 2012 had always been, going all the way back to independence, of security services, in particular the police, blatantly interfering in electoral processes on behalf of the leaders that they were personally loyal to, most frequently on behalf of the regime to keep it in power. So come 2012, the Sierra Leoneans do not want that anymore because they've had experience of an extended civil war that's a consequence of that kind of behavior. So they established a program to bring all the police in at the policeman, policewoman level, all the way down in the local police stations, and educate them about their responsibilities during an election. Simple stuff. Don't wear party colors. Maintain a specific distance from the voting place when you maintain security. Break up fights. Don't become part of them. Don't interfere on behalf of one group against another. Keep the peace. And in addition to providing this message to the police, they brought in the communities. Because after all, the communities are complicit in this. It is the communities whose idea of contesting an election is to go into the street with our clubs and duke it out with the supporters of the opponents. And so the process educated the communities. This is what you should expect from your police. This is why. Now, this was not a donor program. There was a little bit of money that the Americans and a couple of other donors provided, but it wasn't much. This was a Sierra Leonean program. It was designed by the Sierra Leoneans. It was implemented, and it was successful because of people like you at your level in Sierra Leone that communicated the message, made clear that it had the support of the political leadership, and made sure it got out to every police station and every community in the country. The consequence of this was the 2012 election, which was scrutinized by hordes of international observers, was one of the cleanest, least violent elections in the history of Sierra Leone. And one of the things that the observers commented on was the conduct of the police and security forces in securing the electoral process. And what's the message here? You can make a difference. You can make a huge difference in changing the culture to one of respect for rule of law. Okay. Now I'm going to say some of the hard things, and I'm going to generalize. And here's the first one. Justice systems, judges, magistrates, criminal justice processes, prisons. in Africa, across the continent, are under-resourced, poorly developed, the last priority in discussions of security, in national security councils, at national levels. That is the lifeblood of rule of law. If you want to know why corruption is such a problem, that's the main reason. And one of the reasons that happens is when national security councils get together and the chief of defense forces tells us this is what the military needs, and the director of general police says this is what the police needs, there's nobody there articulating that message for the justice system. You need to articulate that message. When you're the chief of defense forces, when you're the director general of police, you need to be the person sitting there in that meeting saying, Mr. President, we have got to do something about the magistrates. We've got to do something about the judges. We've got to do something about the prisons, because our effectiveness depends on the ability of our judicial counterparts to do their job effectively, to deliver those decisions independently, fairly, promptly, without being paid off, and without being told by the brother-in-law of the president or the chief of defense forces, hey, you make sure you find that guy guilty. That has got to be fixed. Okay, the second one talks to a particular feature of Africa. It's not unique to Africa, but it's probably more prevalent in Africa than any place else in the world. And that is the role of non-state security actors. Okay? One of the biggest problems is that, especially outside the capital or outside the city center, when you get out to those sprawling neighborhoods of immigrants from the countryside, rule of law doesn't run. The police are ineffective. The justice system doesn't work. Either it's not present at all or nobody trusts it. So where do people go for justice? Where do they go for protection? They go to the clan chief. They go to the mosque. They go to the council of elders. They go to traditional and customary bodies. The problem with that is those traditional and customary bodies aren't accountable. And they also are almost always rooted in unique ethnic systems, cultural systems. Now, if towns and villages in Africa were homogenous, if they were all Muslim, if they were all Mandingo, if they were all Mendi, if they were all Kikuyu, that might not be that much of a problem. But Africa's not like that. Probably Africa's never been like that. All of these communities are heterogeneous. All of them have different ethnic groups, different religions, represented in the same village, living side by side, just like our Gio and Mandingo neighbors. And the Gio is quite happy to go to the Gio paramount chief for justice. But he's not going to go to the mosque, because the mosque is going to favor the Muslims. They're going to favor the Mandingos. The Mandingo's not going to go to the paramount chief of the Quran, because he's going to favor the Quran. Besides, he's different. He's a different culture. He's got a different system. He doesn't understand me. So when you underwrite these non-state processes that look like they have local legitimacy, and in some cases they do, but only among their particular group, may even have a little bit of local functionality, but they're not accountable, and they got no oversight. And what happens when you got bodies involved in security that have no accountability and no oversight? And when they represent different groups that are in conflict, they can make instability worse, not better. Now there's some good news here. And I go back to the Blaise Pascal comment, justice without force is powerless, force without justice is tyranny. There are some examples coming out of Africa of building bridges between the traditional sector and the formal sector. Because I do not live in a dream world. I understand that I can't simply stand up one morning and say, hey, all those traditional justice providers, we're going to get rid of all of them today. It would be nice if I could wave a magic wand and make my justice system and my police force, my police service effective out to every corner of my country. But I can't do that. So for the foreseeable future, I have to live with those non-state actors. So if I have to live with them, what does that mean? That means I have to find a way to make them accountable. I have to build a bridge between traditional and customary practices and the formal justice and policing sector. And I have to do it in ways that mitigate the problems of letting the local paramount, the local paramount chief or the local mullah in the mosque hand out justice to the community. Now, one of the examples for an approach that offers promise in this area comes out of South Sudan. As odd as that may sound, looking at how problematic South Sudan is. But in South Sudan, the communities are very much what I described. They're heterogeneous. They have different ethnic groups, different languages, living side by side. And those traditional practices were unique to each one of those little groups. So in South Sudan, what has started to emerge are alternative dispute resolution processes where each one of those little groups has a seat at the table. And you see a common process with representation for all the different ethnic groups in the village that addresses the different cultural traditions, the different religions, the religious boundaries. And in South Sudan, it's been fairly effective. Now, what that doesn't address is the underlying problem that any magistrate's going to tell you that says, hey, if you let that committee hand down justice, and I'm the magistrate in the village, what does that do to the authority of the state? What does that do to me? And of course, building bridges won't fix that. That's probably the greatest barrier to addressing this problem on the continent right now. How do you harvest the legitimacy and the functionality of local security providers and justice providers that aren't part of the state without undermining state authority? At the same time, they're trying to build the formal sector. You're trying to fix the magistrate system. You're trying to improve your policing. I don't have any answers to that. But I trust that you either do or will. Because you're the ones who are going to have to find them. And I have to tell you, you're a lot more likely to come up with answers than the donors or your American or French or British advisors, certainly than the Chinese. Okay. Let's see. Civil military relations and rule of law. And again, Dan Hampton's going to talk about this at some length. The key to emphasize here is the link between rule of law and civilian control of the military, civilian control of the security services. Rule of law is the foundation in terms of the Constitution, the laws that are published by the National Assembly and signed by the President, the directives that are issued by the executive branch that lay out the rules of the road everybody has to comply with. That is the fundamental underpinning for civil-military relations and civilian control of the military. One of the most important activities in Liberia when I was there in 2006 was the process of the drafting and adoption of the National Defense Act. Last National Defense Act in Liberia had been published in 1956. This was the act that defined the role of the military, the role of the police, the process of authority and command. It was a tremendously contentious process. It took almost a year, but it involved everybody in the debate, and by the time that act was adopted and signed by the President, everybody understood what the projected and proposed role of the security services was going to be, and how the political leadership of the country, in the person of the President, the Minister of Defense, and the Defense and Security Commission in the legislature, how they were going to exercise authority over those services. That is rule of law. That is the foundation. Okay, key questions. This is what I hope you will talk about the rest of today, frankly, the rest of the week, and print this slide out, put it in your briefcase, and tack it up on the wall of your office. These are the questions you need to think about all the time. Question number one, to what degree do security actors in Africa, that's you, abide by rule of law? How serious are the problems of impunity, corruption and political partisanship amongst us. Second question, are the foundations for rule of law present? Constitution, necessary laws, implementing directives from the executive branch, decisions from the judiciary about the interpretation of key provisions of the Constitution. Are they present? Do they support separation of powers? Is there enabling legislation for oversight and accountability? And the last question is probably the most important. Are these foundations respected by citizens, security providers, and political elites? The law doesn't mean anything if we don't obey it, if we don't abide by it. And ultimately, abiding by it is voluntary. The police enforce the sanctions, and the judiciary hands down decisions, convictions, or acquittals against lawbreakers. But for the vast majority of citizens, leaders, and officials, we abide by the law because we believe in it, because we value compliance. Finally, how effective are your justice venues? Are they able to function independently? Are they generally free from corruption? Are they without partisan political interference? And if the answers to any of those questions are no, notwithstanding the fact that almost all of us in here are not part of the justice sector, it is in our interest, individually and institutionally, to address those issues. We can't function effectively without our justice partners. Okay, so what are the key issues? Once again, I know I'm going to step on some toes here. A big one is civilian oversight of police and law enforcement. You know, civilian control of the military is something we've talked about forever. We all know what it is. We all know how you do it. Doesn't work as well as it should sometimes, but it's pretty straightforward. Civilian control of policing and civil law enforcement is much different. We don't understand that. We don't understand that in the United States, and we don't do it very well. Policemen aren't supposed to arrest somebody because the captain told them to. They're supposed to arrest somebody based on their own independent judgment and their observation of that person's conduct and their knowledge of the law. It is the individual policeman who decides to make that arrest, nobody else. Well, how do you provide oversight and accountability to that guy without interfering in his exercise of his judgment? This is a question the Kenyans are grappling with right now, have been grappling with since 2007. And I'll tell you, for all the criticism the Kenyans get, the Kenyans are more aggressively pursuing reform in their policing and law enforcement sector than anybody else on the continent. And they're finding out how hard it is. Establishing, on the one hand, appropriate oversight and accountability measures, and on the other, preserving the ability of your law enforcement officers to do their jobs in accordance with the law, without inappropriate interference from the top. That's one, if you're looking for some place that really needs attention, creativity, innovative approaches, that's it. And that's one where I hope you can make a huge impact. Okay. Community relations access, that's really part of the police issue. Let me go to this third one, my personal favorite. Presidential guards and national intelligence services. Presidential guards and national intelligence services are the biggest single problem in African security sectors today. They are unaccountable. They lack oversight. The presidential guards tend to be loyal to the person of the head of state or the president. They operate outside normal command channels. They're funded off budget. They act with impunity. And we saw some of the outcome of this in Burkina Faso recently. It's time for us to get rid of presidential guards. They need to go. The military needs to be in charge of military security for the president. The police need to be in charge of civil security for him. You don't need a presidential guard. Long since past the time those organizations should be gone. And they are gone. They're disappearing, and that's a good thing. Intelligence services, this is a much bigger problem. And that problem isn't getting addressed. And once again, what are intelligence services in Africa? And by the way, this is a problem everywhere. This is a problem in the United States. We have this problem with the CIA. Accountability and oversight. Intelligence services in Africa are loyal to the person of the president. Rather than gathering intelligence on national security threats, they're used as a tool to keep the current regime in power. They maintain surveillance on the opposition political parties. They arrest opposition politicians. They ignore rule of law. We have got to fix this. This is important for us because our soldiers and our policemen need to have accurate, timely intelligence about the threats. And they're not going to have that if our intelligence service is bugging political opposition rallies. And my last story I want to tell here, because this is kind of, I know I'm asking you to take principled positions that there are always costs for. This is a story of a chief of a national intelligence service. I know this guy very well. He was a retired chief of the Defense Forces. He's a professional soldier. He's not an intelligence guy. So after he retired from the Defense Forces, the new president appointed him as director of the National Intelligence Service. So he took over the National Intelligence Service. I mean, he's a qualified military professional. He knows how to run a big organization. He's in the process of sorting that out, and the new president calls him in. The new president says, I want you to go down and find out what the political opposition's doing. There's an election coming up. I want you to bug their offices. I want you to monitor their rallies and maintain their and maintain surveillance of all their activities. And I may want you to arrest a couple of these guys. And Director of the Intelligence Service says to the president, that's not what the National Intelligence Service is for. The National Intelligence Service is to report on genuine threats to the national security of the nation. That's my job and the job of my agency, and that's what I'm going to do. And no, I'm not going to go down and bug political opposition rallies. Now, 4 weeks later, that director was dismissed and replaced with someone else. Okay. But in standing up to the president and confirming his constitutional duties and his legitimate responsibilities, that director fundamentally changed the debate in his country and had a tremendous impact. Is the intelligence service fixed today? No. But it's getting fixed, and it's going to get fixed. We have to address this problem. It's going to be difficult, but the costs of not doing it as we confront these transnational threats we've been talking about for the past week, existential threats in some cases, the cost of not addressing intelligence reform for us is too high. And I'm sorry I went longer than I should have, so I'll close it there.